All right, in this video we're kicking off the term by looking at administrative law, history, theory and context. Now that's a bit of an underwhelming title, but this stuff is really important, and where it's particularly important, I think, is building the bridge from novice students who, are all quite intelligent law students, and what the textbook assumes that you know, which is someone who already knows administrative law. So I think this is a good opportunity to set out the foundations, describe the scope of this area that we're going to study. And also I think this is probably the point at which people who bounce off of admin law do bounce off of it, because it doesn't really operate in the same way that your contracts or your torts or your criminal law operates. In fact, a whole lot of it really, technically speaking, isn't law. So I think by setting out just the framework of administrative law and the history of how it got to be that way, hopefully that will help you build that bridge and go, okay, now I see how it operates and why it is the way it is. All right, so what is administrative law? It is law and legal style administrative action that reviews and holds accountable the decisions of government. So flashback quickly to the doctrine of separation of powers, as you would have no doubt gone through in constitutional law. Our system is built on a separation of legislature, executive and judiciary, although the barrier between legislature and executive is kind of blurry at times. Judiciary is always kept completely separate, and each of those sets of powers have different ways of being held accountable. So the legislature, the lawmakers in Parliament, are held accountable through constitutional law and ultimately through the electoral process as well. The judiciary is held accountable through the appeals process, up until the point of the High Court, but there is that sense, and we also have that accountability through parliamentary supremacy, that if Parliament really doesn't like a decision the court makes, they can always create a new law that overrides it, except where there's that constitutional problem. But then we've got this big bulk of government in the middle that we call variously the administration, the executive. Confusingly enough, it's sometimes called government, the government part of government. That's helpful. But it's all the non-elected people who do the business of government. Now, the head of state is part of the executive branch, so the Governor General, the Queen, the King. I have to get used to saying the King. But we have people who are like the Prime Minister and the ministers, the Premier and the ministers at state level, who are both part of the legislature but also wear a different hat as head of the executive. Let's not go into why that is, but that's just the way our system works. It's different to the United States, where the executive is separate and elected separately and they have a president. The idea being that you'll have a much more robust and accountable system, because you're always going to have this tension between the legislature and the president, and they'll balance each other out. Maybe that hasn't worked out so well over history, and I'm not just talking about the latest president, but it was a good idea in theory that we have this check, that they thought that would be a check and balance. But for us, our check and balance is primarily through the administrative law system that has means and methods of challenging decisions made by those unelected people, reviewing those decisions and hopefully altering those decisions. So there's really, I guess, there's a sort of a pyramid. There's three sides to administrative law that we're going to explore. One side is the old administrative law that goes back hundreds of years. The second side is what was called the new administrative law, although it comes from the 70s like I do, so it's about as old as I am, but it was often referred to at the time as the new administrative law, which was designed to fix the old administrative law. And in many ways it has. In many ways it's pretty much completely replaced that old set of laws. And then the bottom part of the pyramid is the different legislative means and programs that are designed to supplement and protect and enhance those two forms of administrative law. So we're talking about things like freedom of information, privacy law, commissions of inquiry, ombudsman, all these things that are designed to make those other two forms effective. So before I get into the history of this, what are they? What's the old and new administrative law? Well, the old administrative law is a system of court-based review. We call it judicial review most often, where you go to court and you have a decision of an administrator, a bureaucrat, reviewed by the court. Sounds great. Problem is, there's only very, very narrow means in which they can review those decisions. It's an expensive process, and at the end of the day, they can't change. All they can do is nullify that decision and send it back to the original decision maker to make it again, hopefully in the correct way. So it's really a focus on the process and making sure that the process is observed. But at the end of the day, you might not end up with any remedy. You can send it back and they'll just make the same decision, but, do it in a different way. The new administrative law was introduced in the 1970s as a more publicly accessible form of justice, and it is not a legal process. It is an administrative process, and it is largely done through tribunals, which confuses everyone because they look like courts. But they're not courts. They're actually a bit like, can I talk to your manager? They're a method of internal review for bureaucracies, which they may already have internal review. There may already be a process you can go to. But what they created in the new administrative law was kind of an uber top-level review body. At the federal level, it was the Administrative Appeals Tribunal. States were to follow later. It's now called the ART. We'll get round to all of that. But basically, this is tribunal you can go to. You can make an application. It's cheaper. Originally, you weren't even allowed to bring lawyers, but it's kind of designed to not follow the legal process in the same way that judicial review does. And crucially, they rehear the whole decision on its merits. So they're not limited to looking at the way in which a decision was made. They're not limited by handing the decision back to the original decision maker. They have the advantage of being able to say, okay, I don't like the original decision, I'm going to substitute a new decision and push it back through that way. So at this point you might be asking, well, why do we even have the old administrative law? Why does it even exist? Why don't we do everything through this new tribunal system? And the fact of the matter is we do. There is very little that happens through those old means of administrative law, the old legal judicial review methods. It will seem rather strange. It will spend 2/3 of the term looking at that system that no one ever uses and think, well, why are we doing this if everyone's just using the new system? Well, we'll come to that in a few weeks, but there's a few reasons. One is that while the new administrative law, the 1970s administrative law, had bipartisan support, over the years, successive governments of both sides have chipped away at it. And have chipped away at its effectiveness, have put more and more decisions outside of the ambit of the tribunal system. So sometimes the old method is the only method you've got left, because your rights under that new system have been eroded. Another reason is, and this comes to one of the things we're going to talk about again and again in this term, is that the actual principles developed through the old administrative law are pretty good. They talk about making decisions on the basis of good evidence, making it without bias, not straying outside of the area of power that's been allocated to you. They're actually a really sound and sensible set of design principles. So even though the early administrative review tribunals were like, out with the law, we're not dealing with law anymore, and the original tribunal members were not lawyers, gradually over time, more and more of the tribunal people have been lawyers, and they've brought the admin law principles, ideas, with them to that role. And I don't think that's such a bad thing. I mean, some of the people who were like from the social work background, and for instance, lamented this as the law colonising and taking over the appeal system. But honestly, I think we can draw on the strengths of law in order to say, well, what is a fair process? What sort of evidence do you need to draw on? As lawyers, we're used to looking at precedent. We're looking at that discussions over different fact scenarios in which this happened in order to make that decision. Now, the point I also want to extend in terms of what we're doing in this course in terms of legal design is that those are not just important when you come to a conflict that has happened, and you have to resolve a conflict. But I would argue that these are actually really sound principles to design new systems, to evaluate existing systems, and as principles of leadership when you're making decisions. And again, I think I said this in the introductory video, those principles apply to all public bodies, but there's no reason why someone as a decision maker in a private organisation shouldn't think a bit more about what is a fair process. You know, what does it mean to give someone a right to be heard? There's no legal compulsion to do that in a private organisation, but it's probably a good idea. And it's probably good to draw on some of those social values that underpin administrative law. So, yes, those old principles, ye olde administrative law, almost no one works in that field except in those areas where people's rights have been taken away by government. Boo boo. But they are useful because of that creep, that erosion that's happening under to the people's rights. But also, I think it's worth spending some time looking at what people have said about, you know, the right to fairness, the right to be heard, the rule against bias, for us to think ourselves, well, what do those things mean as system design ideas? What does it mean for future conflicts? All right, so keep that as we move forward, keep that pyramid in mind. We've got the old form of judicial review, expensive, limited, whatever else, but is the source of a whole lot of discussion about what it is to be fair and accountable as a decision maker. We've got the new administrative law, which was supposed to and has largely replaced it, but you know, is under threat every day. And then we've got all these other systems like the freedom of information, the right to actually get information, find out what information the government holds on you, the right to demand a reason for a decision. You know, it's all very well to be able to challenge someone who's made a decision unfairly, but if they don't give you a reason for decisions, it's very hard to challenge what they've done. So we have a statutory right to force decision makers to tell you their reasons for the decision. And then we have various things like royal commissions, commissions of inquiry, ombudsman, various other mechanisms and institutions that are designed to make the whole system fairer and more accountable. And in the workshop this week, we're going to look at some of the connections between our ideas of democracy and accountability and how that kind of connects back into the law. Because that's the reason we're here in admin law, is to try and protect democracy ultimately. And all right, so we'll start with the idea of those three branches of government. I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the history, just to give you some touch points onto where it all came from. If you're not really sure about the three divisions of power, go back and have another read at your constitutional law, or ask me some questions where you're not sure. There is some discussion in the text about people saying there should be a fourth branch of government, which is the accountability branch, and it's kind of funny, the quotes from judges in response to this, who are just basically, that's just nonsense, that's just megalomania from people from regulatory agencies. So yeah, there's an interesting, although probably not so interesting to anyone who doesn't work in the field, debate in the textbook about, should we have four divisions of government, and should the integrity branch of government be recognised as a separate branch of government? And I must admit, I'm with the judges on that one. We don't need another branch of government just to satisfy the egos of people who work in that, and it doesn't serve any purpose. All right, let's look at the origins of administrative law as a system, and hopefully that will give you an idea of why it has taken the kind of shape that it has. So let's start before separation of powers. Let's start before democracy. Let's start when there's no parliament and there was just a king. So the regional powers, such as they were, was basically just the crown. Sovereignty vested in the crown, in the king, through most of history, at least in British history. And the king would then delegate power to individuals. They would say, look, the moat's looking pretty grimy and it's full of dead horses and carts and things. I give you a royal commission. I'll give you 3 pieces of silver if you go and clean out the moat. So the very origins of what is the public sector, the administrative sector, the governmental sector, whatever we call it, was just these ad hoc commissions that came from the king, and the king wanted something done. What we didn't have any parliament. The judiciary was really just the enforcer for the king. They had no independence. But when someone failed in their task, the king had to do something about that. And what they would then do is use these writs to pull the person in before the court and say, "The king, I've gave you 3 pieces of silver. The moat is still a disgrace. I want to force you to do what you're told to do. Or you've made a decision, I want to force you to make that decision properly." So the very all the origins of admin law are actually tied into the king's power, way before there was any democratic power. What we saw over time was, again, less of this one-off commissions and more of ongoing roles. So instead of having like a one-off commission to clean the moat, you'd have the moat sanitary department. And there'll be people who would be employed to clean the moat out from time to time. So you'd see the development of this class of unelected decision makers who were given power to make decisions. And this was they were often given the power to make their own rules and their own laws. And this is where we have regulations, which I know you've covered in your intro to law subject, but here is where it fits in originally. So rather than just saying, "Here you have the power to clean the moat, and I'll give you the authority to do this, this, and this," you can also give the person authority to make decisions in relation to X, Y, and Z. You can give them the ability to make up their own rules. So you can appoint someone as the rat catcher, and you can say, "We also give you the power to make your own rules about, what you do when you catch rats, and what size of rats you catch, and what size nets you use, and what poisons you use, and whatever." And this is where we get delegated legislation, this is where we get regulations, and this is where we get that split between the legislature and the regulations. And up until comparatively recently, we really saw that part of government as being really a minor part of government. Even like local government in Australia is all a creation of state level legislation. So your local councils, while they look like a legislature, you'd vote for councillors and whatever, they're actually administrative bodies with elected members. And there was this kind of prejudice early on, which still continues today, that like the legislature makes the real laws, and then all these delegated authorities just make these kind of little meaningless, everyday laws. They're like the dog catcher and the moat cleaner and whatever, the rat catcher. What we have seen over time is those organisations become very, very powerful, very, very influential, and we've seen more and more power being delegated out of the hands of the legislature to the hands of these administrative bodies, just because of the complexity of society. I mean, there's other factors at play there as well. But just because we've got such an increasingly complex society, we can't wait for Parliament to meet and debate a law every time, the rat catcher needs to approve a different poison to poison rats with, or whatever. You get what I'm saying, hopefully. So we've seen a substantial drift away from the idea of power and sovereignty being primarily vested in the legislature and the Crown and the head of state, to all these authorities and bureaucracies. And I have missed a step here, of course, which is the creation of the legislature. So let's just step back a moment. So when I was talking originally, I talked about how this was all about the king and the king's relationship with their flunkies. What they had in Britain was a big civil war, big revolution, king's head chopped off, and a renegotiation of power between Parliament and the king. And the king moving back to being a symbolic head, and Parliament, because Parliament controlled taxation, Parliament being the source of sovereignty in society and the source of popular sovereignty. Their sovereignty came through a democratic process, through people being elected. What a minor thing for me to just skip over. What that also meant was that accountability for those administrative bodies didn't go back to the king anymore, except for some very small circumstances, like the royal household or whatever, the accountability then went back to the Prime Minister, the Minister, the elected members of Parliament. And they were the ones who created bureaucracies, created authorities, created these organisations and people. So a lot of the administrative law, the focus of administrative law then shifted towards Parliament. And as democracy became more of a issue, became more of a recognised as a source of sovereignty, we also saw a democratisation of administrative law, and we saw more and more of these old writs that were designed for the king being used by individuals. Of course, they were purely used by powerful and wealthy individuals, but at least there was like a broadening of that ability. So that's where we kind of sit into the 20th century. We've got a sovereign parliament, we've got a large and growing executive as society becomes more complicated. We've got a head of state that's supposed to just rubber stamp things. But we've also seen some crises in relation to bureaucracy. We've seen early sociologists really praise the idea of bureaucracy. The idea that a bureaucracy would break us out of these medieval ways of thinking and would free us. So rather than there being rule based on whim and rule by the powerful, then there was rule-based law. This is, rule of law, that you would actually have bureaucratic authorities who would be more logical, reasonable, and accountable than you would have letting the powerful people make those decisions. That was a very optimistic idea of bureaucracy, and at the same time in the early 20th century we also saw the rise of dystopian ideas of bureaucracy, people that actually worked within bureaucracies and realised that there was a whole lot of problems with the system that deferred responsibility for decision making. Fiction writer Franz Kafka, a lot of his fiction, the stuff that wasn't about people turning into cockroaches, was about the horrific nature of these big bureaucracies and how confusing and alienating they were. What we also saw, and not to want to return everything to Nazi Germany, but what we really saw was a state turn its bureaucratic power towards something which people would, at the time and before and afterwards, see as a breach of natural justice, a breach of what government should be doing. And yet you get a big enough bureaucracy behind you and you mobilise a machinery to exterminate various classes of people in society, that bureaucracy will just trundle along really happily and do it. And that lack of accountability enables that kind of behaviour. And it's an interesting question of, if everyone in the Nazi framework were all accountable for the decisions that they made, would they have made the decisions that they did? Or is it the fact that they were all able to point to, well, I'm just part of a system, it's nothing to do with me, I just do my job? Was that what was able to enable that to happen? A live discussion that is something that we continue to talk about today, and we continue to talk about in the field of human rights. But we also we come a long way round back to administrative law, because the development of administrative law was also developed out of that post-World War II ferment of activity where we said we can't allow this sort of thing to happen. We can't allow these bureaucracies to get out of hand and to, do these terrible things on an industrial scale. And one of the ways of doing that is to make those bodies more accountable. Why aren't they accountable now? Well, the old administrative law that was supposed to keep them accountable, it's inaccessible, it's expensive, and at the end of the day, you may not actually get a result because it may just get sent back to the original decision maker. Let's create the new administrative law. So that brings us on to the late 60s, early 70s. There was also a bit of an enthusiasm for Scandinavian forms of government, which kind of fed into that. And one thing that I think is really interesting from contemporary perspective is there was non-partisan, cross-party support for the creation of the new administrative law. It's almost unheard of now. Someone would go to Parliament with a good idea and everyone would go, yeah, that looks like a great idea, let's do it. So while most of the new administrative law was the creation of the Whitlam government, which was a Labor government, the running that led up to it and to the creation of it came under a Liberal government. So even though there was, all sorts of conflict and consternation between the political parties even then, there was still the opportunity for someone to bring up something and everyone to go, yeah, it's a great idea, let's do it. I'm not quite sure whether that would happen today or whether people would just just as a reaction say, no, let's not do it because someone else wants to do it. But it is interesting when you look at the parliamentary debates leading up to this. It's like, how come these people got on so well and, all just agreed to agree on a good idea? That's very weird. So historically that brings us into not only the creation of the new administrative law, but those other support mechanisms like having an ombudsman who you can report problems to, having freedom of information, protecting people's privacy, all those things that we're going to cover later, a little later in the course, all were also innovations that came out about that around that point. And there are also things where both sides of Parliament were just like, yeah, okay, let's do this good thing that's going to be good for everyone. All right, so as I alluded to a little earlier, that's been chipped away at. Initially there was kind of like, yes, we're going to include everything in this scheme except for ASIO and the Army, and everything else is going to be reviewable, and every government that's come in subsequently has gone, oh, well, not that, and not that, and not that, and not that either. That being said, then those are the situations where often people are forced to go back to the old administrative law because it's like, well, I don't have my rights anymore, and that is one of the weaknesses of any system of rights that's only based on legislation, is that governments can just chip away at it. And people don't even really notice. I mean, you think how much traction in social media, the idea of having some of your rights to administrative review being chipped away at, how much traction is that going to have? How many times is that going to be re-X'd on X or shared on Facebook or whatever? And people don't really notice until they end up with one of those everyday conflicts with bureaucracies that blow up. The local council's done something terrible and, cut down all your trees or something, and people are up in arms. And it's like, well, you weren't up in arms back when that power was protected and your right to appeal that power was taken away. No one cared. And I'm not trying to be judgmental about this stuff because I understand the way the world works, and it is hard to get people excited about administrative law. It is hard to get law students excited about administrative law, and I do hear people say all the time, it's terrible, it's hard, I don't want to do it till my very last term because it's such a terrible subject. But I think it's a very strong subject because it is got that everyday application. And it is a way of, dealing with problems with government. And regardless of what your political position is, I think most people agree that government overreach is a problem. At least as it pertains to them personally. So it's something we can still be a little bit united on. Now we're going to talk a little bit later in the workshop about how all this connects back to our ideas of democracy, sovereignty, and so on. It's going to be a bit of a casual chat. It's not going to be intensely theoretical or anything, but I think it's important to make that jump because people drop the D-bomb all the time. They're always saying, but this is a democracy, you can't do that. At least as things affect them. But we need to think a little bit about, well, what does democracy mean? And how does administrative law actually work to protect those fundamental democratic rights that we have? We'll also, throughout the term, talk a little bit around some of the threats to administrative law and some of the transformations that have affected it. So I just want to flag these very briefly now. I've already mentioned the removal of accountability by legislation. It happens by stealth. It happens all the time. Government departments get pulled out of the review process. That's a steady problem. And it also goes with the growth, increasing growth of those bureaucracies. So, when I studied law, it was still like the idea that the legislature was the source of lawmaking, and then we had this little body that sat under it that was the regulatory bodies, that was administration, executive, and whatever. And just in my career, we've seen the non-elected part of lawmaking blow up in size, complexity, and scope. At the same time that the right to review them has been chipped away. The second thing we've seen is our ideas of public and private changing, and a whole lot of public and private hybrid organisations. We've seen a lot of privatisation occur, and that often puts these big pseudo-public authorities outside of the scope of judicial review, because suddenly it's a contract private organisation that's doing it. We're also seeing a lot of hybrid organisations, like development corporations that are part corporate interest, part governmental, and that gets very complicated as well. And the final thing is technology. It's always technology. We've seen the rise of a whole lot of automation, which has taken the bureaucratic power that's given to human individuals away and into machine systems and algorithms. And that, of course, is accelerating with the development of AI, and the idea that AI is going to take over some of those roles as well, and going to be, so much faster and more effective at making these decisions. And there's severe problems with that. And next week we're going to focus on the Robodebt inquiry and the absolute storm that happened around that. And that's going to be, next week's topic, I think, is decisions and decision making, which is, honestly, by itself, a fairly bland topic. But what I'm going to do is we're going to look at the Robodebt controversy in detail, because it basically touches on every single area of administrative law and invents some new problems to face in terms of administrative law. It was such a colossal set of mistakes, and it runs across everything that we're going to talk about this term. So that'll spice up a topic which in the sort of textbook is a little bit dry, but we'll get there. All right. So hopefully, I know that's been a big dump of information, and this is a longer video than I usually do, but I'm hoping this will give you a set of knowledge that'll bridge your ordinary kind of knowledge you've got from introduction to law and things you've studied at school to, well, where are we going in terms of the accountability of administrative bodies. Remember the triangle. Remember there's those three things we're going to look at, and we'll start exploring those throughout this term, and not only what that means in terms of being an advocate for people who have had their rights breached, but also what it means to be someone who works in those fields. What is it to be someone who is developing a new set of rules, a new set of procedures, even down to designing the way, physical design of an office. How do all these things impact? What is the impact of our ideas of administrative justice and democracy on all those different capabilities beyond being a legal advocate? So I hope that's something you'll enjoy, and also something that'll get you thinking a little bit differently. And ultimately, the fact that universities are all subject to the administrative law system will give you a little bit of a bit of a handle on the topic, to think about all the decisions that are made in and around you by universities. That admin law becomes very relevant. And in one of the things I did forget to mention when I just talked about those different things that are changing in the way in which We've got the removal of accountability, we've got public-private hybrids, we've got technology. The things I probably should put in the fourth there is the revolving door between government agencies and administration and the public sector, private sector. So we've got situations where people who are regulators, who are making decisions to regulate industries, then leave those industries and end up with cushy jobs in the people that they've made decisions about. And that has emerged as a significant problem. And it's a significant problem with the universities too, because if you're watching some of the controversies that are evolving in the news right now, we've got a problem where universities are paying millions of dollars over to consultants. Those consultants are sitting on university councils, which are supposed to be a democratic body, and then people who are senior administrators from those universities are leaving and getting well-paid jobs with those consultancy firms. So, universities aren't spared from this as well. And that's another trend I think we should try and address throughout this term, is this revolving door between government, between regulators and industry, and the way in which wealth corrupts the decision-making that's made in those roles. So lots of stuff to discuss this term. Hope you're excited, hope you're enthused, and let's please keep this conversation going.